So I'm Dr. Kelly McCann. Thank you so much for coming. Really happy that you guys are here. And I was communicating back and forth with Julie Olson, who is a functional nutritionist. And I was actually a guest on her summit earlier in June this year, and it was on hair loss. And she did a fantastic job and had so many different speakers and all this information about hair loss. But one of the things that we both learned for me being on her summit was that mast cells and mast cell activation syndrome is a huge part of hair loss. And so I was remiss in not having Julie be on my summit. So this is actually an amazing opportunity for you all to learn about the relationship between hair loss and mast cell activation, because I think it's a really important issue, and we'll definitely have to have Julie on our next summit when we do it again next year. But in the meantime, you'll have her at your disposal to answer questions. So let's talk a little bit about hair loss. Um, Tell me what you learned and what your understanding is, Julie, so we can share that with the folks here today.
Well, it begins at the cellular level. So our hair follicles are part of a niche of cells involved in proper immune function. And right next to the type of cell that grows our hairs, there's a number of immune cells, including mast cells, but also macrophages, basophils, and neutrophils.
Mhm.
And so when there becomes an inflammatory response or an overload of histamine, a number of cytokine signaling molecules can generate unwanted cell responses that tend to progress hair loss.
Very interesting. I think one of the things I had forgotten from medical school and I learned when I was preparing for our lecture was the different cycles of hair. So can you walk us through the cycles of hair and how that all works?
Well, there's there's about three different cycles and growth cycles, but the third cycle is uh, where it's the resting phase, and that's what is often what happens with mast cell activation is it pops you prematurely into that resting phase. It's called telogen effluvium, basically, and that's even the type of hair loss that the COVID shed is a chronic inflammatory stress induced type of hair loss. And um, that's also where the histamine response that you get with mast cell activation comes into play here, because it it really does put a stress on your body, and it makes it so that that hair follicle not only goes into that resting phase prematurely, but it can destroy it.
Yikes. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound good. So yeah, there's the anagen phase where it's growing and our hair is supposed to be, 85% of the time in that phase, right? And then and that should go on for like 2 to 6 years. It really is a long period of time that the majority of the hair follicles are there. And then there's a short catagen phase and then it goes into the telogen phase, which is the resting phase. It's only supposed to last 3 to 5 weeks. But
Right.
when there's significant stress or inflammation, um, and the other thing, I think talking about COVID is a great way to think about it because so many people who had COVID had hair loss. Um, so when there's that huge response, that huge stressor of COVID and all the inflammation that the body makes with COVID to try and um, deal with the virus, that has a side effect of impacting the hair follicles, pushing them into the telogen phase where they're not supposed to be, and then all the hair sheds. Does that sound about right?
Right, right, exactly. And when humans experience stress, the body tends to release histamine in much larger amounts, and this excess histamine is believed to affect hair follicles and act as part of a pathology of stress-induced telogen effluvium. And they've done some studies, and it showed that people with telogen effluvium had significantly higher numbers of mast cells, and the enzyme triptase.
Tryptase,
How
yes.
do you pronounce that? um, which is actually involved, as you know, in the deregulation of proteins, which our hair needs. Is basically our hair is made of protein, um, and it removes the lysine, histidine, and arginine. So higher tri tryptase is a hallmark of
Tryptase, yes,
okay,
tryptase.
is a hallmark of mast cell activation and part of this whole conversation. So,
Right, right. And people can have all of these things without having high tryptase. It's not necessary to have a high tryptase, but it's certainly one of those markers of mast cell activation. And then histamine as an inflammatory molecule can trigger more mast cells to react and have more inflammation. The other thing that I think it's really important for people to understand about mast cells is that they really do, they really have three different impacts that they have in terms of the mediators. So they have allergic responses. So that would be your histamine and some of the different um, other molecules. And then they also have an inflammatory response. So all the cytokines and chemokines, that's often mast cell reaction. Like when we're thinking about COVID as kind of a hallmark of exploration of thinking about mast cells. So you've got the allergic component, which many patients are with who have mast cell are familiar with. You've got the inflammatory component, and then the third component that mast cells produce is that they produce these different growth enzymes, and these growth enzymes could be modulating um, changing the structure of the scalp, right? Um, so that is one of the possible mechanisms that's happening too, is when we have an inflammatory response, the mast cells are reacting on the scalp. Not only you're creating histamine, you're creating these different growth molecules that can change things so that the scalp becomes more fibrous, which then will damage the hair follicles further and prevent and reduce the amount of hair follicles, because you're changing the structure. The elastin is changing, the structure of the scalp is changing, leading to more permanent kinds of hair loss.
right, more the scarring, and both androgenetic alopecia and alopecia areata show signs of dysregulated histamine signaling,
Yes.
which induces pro-inflammatory cascades like you were talking about, and causes the premature death of cells, especially as it relates to the cells around the hair follicle on the scalp. And it makes it really difficult to regrow hair, since these stem cells around the scalp um, are no longer present.
Right, right. I mean, maybe people can envision from biology. I remember like the little teardrop looking follicle and then the hair that came out. And it's really the health of the follicle that determines the health of the hair. Correct?
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, that's why 49% of hair transplants don't work, because their hair follicle is not healthy, because something in their body is not healthy or out of balance. I mean, you can't grow a garden in clay.
Right. That's
Kind
a
of a side
perfect
there.
analogy. That's a perfect analogy. Yeah. So, and from the literature, we know that there are a lot more mast cells on the skin, and it turns out there are more mast cells in the area where there's hair loss, probably because the mast cells were drawn there due to something that they needed to fight, something that they needed to address. So, for example, it could be that the bacteria, the microbiome of the skin was out of balance. The body had to react in a certain way to try and fight that imbalance. And then that called in all the mast cells, and then that caused the inflammation that led to the situation where people now have hair loss. Sound about
Right.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you throw in like the loss of immune privilege.
So
Um,
tell us about that. What does
oh
that
wow,
mean?
open the
Do
can of
your
worms
best.
here.
I'll jump in.
Well, especially alopecia areata,
Which is
uh,
the autoimmune component, right?
right, is there's usually a large change in the immune function due to the loss of immune privilege. And immune privilege is really a mechanism the body uses to keep immune systems and out of certain sensitive tissues. So this lends itself to the hair follicle tissues.
Mm,
And so when the hair follicles experience a collapse of the immune privilege, then they're going to experience a dramatic increase in a variety of different immune problems and factors that can also trigger histamine and the release histamine release from mast cells and just cause even more that inflammation. And inflammation is a top root cause, functional root cause of hair loss. I mean, there's over 50 causes of hair loss, but I put them into 4 categories: inflammatory, digestive, stress induced, and hormonal. So this
okay.
pretty
50 different causes of hair loss. Wow, that's crazy.
much.
And so now we're talking about mast cell, which would be in the inflammatory component, right?
Right.
Okay. I guess it could be diet too, potentially, but most
Sure,
most
it's kind of a matrix. It's a vicious cycle. You
right.
know, if you have that stress and then you don't eat well, or you don't eat well, or it's a chicken or the egg, you know. I mean, you
Chicken
don't
or the
sleep well,
egg,
so you don't eat well, and it just keeps going on and on.
right?
Um,
Or you
but
have food sensitivities, develop leaky gut
sure,
because of mast cell activation. Now you've got gut inflammation, malabsorption. That's a nutrient depletion, triggering more inflammation. So yeah, super crazy about how these things all are all linked together. I'm curious, what were some of the other like beautiful nuggets that you learned? Maybe not so much about mast cell, but just about hair loss and how people can really, it's like, what are some good takeaways that you have?
oh,
What's your favorite thing to tell people about if they're coming to you and they're worried about hair loss or they have hair loss for certain reasons? What is your favorite thing to tell people? I'm
it's
putting you
not
on the
a death
spot. Don't
sentence.
be silly.
I have to tell them it's not a death sentence. You can, there's hope, and you can reverse this. As long as you don't have scarring of the hair follicle. I did. I didn't have scarring of the hair follicle, but I reversed it naturally, and I was told over and over there was nothing they could do about it. But it is very complicated, and and there there are different overlapping causes. I mean, the 4 functional um, root causes I just mentioned. Again, there's just so much overlap, but there is a lot you can do if you're patient and get some good functional labs and start digging and getting your body back into balance. I mean, I
Right.
say, yeah.
Yeah. So whether you have extreme mast cell activation or you have post-COVID hair loss, many of the steps that you're going to go through to get your health back are very similar, right? You have to
Very similar.
address the diet. You have to um, calm down the inflammation. Do all of the things that we know in functional medicine to do. There may be a few things that are unique about mast cell and hair loss. So there was some research that came up about topical sertazine. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Oh, you know what? I really take a natural approach. I
Okay.
have not dove into that. And actually, I did come across that and want to give a shout out to a colleague and friend of mine that does incredible hair loss research. That's Rob English.